Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to break down Julius Randle's offensive game, what he looked like in various lineup pairings with other bigs with the Knicks, how that compares to how Karl-Anthony Towns was used alongside Rudy Gobert and Reid in Minnesota, and what to expect out of Julius Randle offensively this season with the Wolves. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is sponsored by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. Today, we're talking all about Julius Randle. We did the crossover podcast on Monday with like the Knicks. Back on Saturday, we did the bonus pod all about the trade in the wake of the trade. Yesterday, I did three positives, focused basically a segment on Randle, a segment on DiVincenzo, and then more broadly the depth. Today's all about Randle. I want to examine what he did with the Knicks in terms of the different lineups he played in, the other bigs he played alongside, and what that looks like in Minnesota. The Timberwolves, yes, they traded away Karl-Anthony Towns. They still have two pretty good bigs in Rudy Gobert and Reid. How does Julius Randle fit with them? And how might Chris Finch deploy some of those lineups? But again, using both last year's Timberwolves team and last year's Knicks team as comparison points for what to potentially expect out of Randle in his first year in Minnesota. So we'll do all that here today. Big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right, so we've established, I'll hit the high points on like my overall, like here's what Julius Randle can do offensively for Minnesota. Karl-Anthony Towns is a more efficient offensive player. There's no question about it. From anywhere on the floor, Cat's a better shooter. Randle, though, is better at drawing fouls. He's better at punishing mismatches, which is related. He plays bully ball. He can play downhill without committing the high volume of offensive fouls that Karl-Anthony Towns did. He's a little bit better in isolation overall, even if sometimes it doesn't manifest as efficiently when he actually gets a shot off, but he can get to the line more frequently. And again, punishing mismatches is a big thing that the Wolves need to be able to do when teams try and guard, combat the Wolves' size by switching matchups, by guarding bigs with smalls, things like that. Because Gobert's not great at punishing matchups either. Neither was Cat. That's something Randle can do that can help. He's also a little bit of a better passer than Karl-Anthony Towns. He's a bit more creative with the ball in his hands, trying to create for others. We talked about his assist rate on drives being much more impressive than Karl-Anthony Towns' assist rate on drives. All of the above are true about Julius Randle. What's interesting is the other bigs that he played with the Knicks, and also examining what the Wolves lineups looked like alongside Rudy Gobert, like Cat next to Rudy, Nas next to Rudy. So there's a couple layers here, and I want to take the Randle layer first. And then we'll compare that to the Timberwolves, like the 2023-24 Timberwolves layer. So let's start with Julius Randle. Julius Randle played his heaviest minutes with either Mitchell Robinson or Isaiah Hartenstein at the 5. And he was pretty good with both of them. Now, they're both good players. And here in a minute, I'm going to compare his minutes with Mitchell Robinson next to the Cat Rudy minutes, because I think that's important. But Mitchell Robinson, the volume of minutes that he played with Mitchell Robinson was a bit greater. I would say Hartenstein's the same sort of archetype big, but I think Mitchell Robinson and Jericho Sims, even Precious Achiuwa, who a lot less minutes for Sims and Achiuwa alongside Julius Randle, all those guys are fairly similar archetype bigs, and would fall in the same category as Rudy Gobert, right? Like a big who is playing off the ball in the offense. You're not running plays for them very frequently. They're rolling, they're cutting, they're rim runners. They're, in theory, defensive-minded centers overall, decent block rates, decent rebound rates, etc. right? The same archetype as Rudy versus, say, Karl-Anthony Towns or Reid, who's a stretch big, who are both stretch bigs. Nas really is almost more of just a big forward than he is a stretch big. We're splitting hairs, or I'm splitting hairs. But anyway, so similar type players. The minutes that Julius Randle played with Mitchell Robinson were good for the Knicks. They were solid, and we'll dig into that here in a minute. They were really good with Isaiah Hartenstein. Really, really good, actually. And that was his best. Hartenstein was his best front court mate. But the Mitchell Robinson minutes, I think, are most relevant because first of all, the volume was large, and I think that Mitchell Robinson's a little bit more similar to Rudy Gobert than Isaiah Hartenstein is. Mitchell Robinson and Julius Randle played 1,140 possessions together, which is still less than half the amount of possessions that Cat and Rudy played together last year. Part of that was injuries with the Knicks. Part of it was just the way that Tibbs shuffled his lineups. But Randle played next to all these different centers, right? Robinson, Achua, Sims, Hartenstein. But anyway, 1,140 possessions. They were a plus 2.3, according to Cleaning the Glass, a plus 2.3 differential over that period of time. Percentile wise, which is kind of the snapshot, quick snapshot way to measure this, it was a 64th percentile overall, or I should say the lineups that those two played in together were 64th percentile overall. Okay. They were 65th percentile on offense and 57th percentile on defense. Those are Robinson Randle lineups. Now, obviously, there's a lot of noise here. It's not accounting for who the other guys on the floor were. I get that. But that's what the numbers say about those guys' lineups together. And again, the Hartenstein minutes were actually a little bit better than this. And then the Sims minutes, we'll talk about this in a minute, were really bad. The Achua minutes were not great, but better than the Sims minutes. So Julius Randle and Mitchell Robinson together were just a plus 2.3, 64th percentile overall lineup. Now flip that and look at Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. And the reason I'm doing this, right, we're just flipping the two guys, right? Randle for Cat in this scenario. Rudy sticks with the Wolves, Robinson with the Knicks. So Cat and Rudy together last year in more than twice as many possessions, over 2,500 possessions together, were a plus 9.2 differential. Try to combine differential and percentile. 91st percentile overall unit. Remember, Robinson and Randle were a 64th percentile unit. Cat and Rudy were a 91st percentile unit. 82nd percentile on offense. Robinson and Randle were 65th. Cat and Rudy were 89th percentile in defense. Robinson and Randle were 57th percentile. So, better on offense, significantly better on defense, significantly better overall, and almost 7 points better in terms of a differential were Cat and Rudy. Now, what does that speak to? Well, I mean, Rudy being better than Robinson's a huge part of it, but also Cat being better than Randle. So, of course, the better duo should have the better differential, the better overall numbers in terms of their offensive and defensive ratings. But I think it underscores exactly that. Cat's better than Randle. Rudy's better than Robinson. Now, what's going to happen when we shuffle this? We'll see. But the other layer here is comparing that to the Nas Reid lineups. So what I want to do next is I want to get into the Timberwolves-centric lineups. So Rudy and Nas on the floor together with no Karl-Anthony Towns, and then also Rudy and Cat on the floor together with no Nas. What are the differences in those lineups, or what were the differences last season in those lineups for the Wolves, and how can we compare that back to Randle's lineup pairings and what he did with the Knicks? We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Go check out the lines for the NFL games this coming Sunday. There's also football on Saturday. Check that out over there, too. When it comes to NBA, I talked about this the other day. The Timberwolves win total on FanDuel did not change. 52.5 is the line for their win totals on the season. It was pre-Karl-Anthony Towns trade. It is still 52.5. The Knicks were at 53.5 pre-trade. It's gone up one win to 54.5 post-acquisition of Karl-Anthony Towns. Pretty interesting stuff. You get started over at FanDuel with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, Check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page on which you place your bets. Again, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet at FanDuel. Again, that's FanDuel.com. Big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, so we talked about Julius Randle's minutes with the Knicks and how he played much better next to Mitchell Robinson, Isaiah Hartenstein, than he did against guys like Sims and Precious Achiuwa. Now, those are shorter, smaller chunks of minutes. And I think that also underscores how much better, how much better Robinson and Hartenstein were than Sims and Achiuwa, right? Like, that's obvious. And that's, a lot of times these numbers don't tell us anything super surprising. It backs up what we've already seen. But there are some pretty interesting things that you can dig up when you look at this lineup data. Like, for instance, I've seen and heard a lot of comments. I actually think, where was it that I saw or heard somebody talking about? I think it was the Austin Rivers was on the Bill Simmons podcast. They recorded it on Saturday following the trade. And I can't remember if it was Simmons or Rivers. I think it was Simmons that was talking about how when Nas was on the floor with Kat last year, Nas was on the floor with Rudy, you're like, oh, okay, this could work. And I think Rivers agreed with it and talking about not just that, but like how sometimes it looks better than it did with Kat. And there's this sense of like, oh, well, Nas with Rudy's even better. And I think Wolves fans, it's not a hard thing to fall into. Everybody loves Nas Reid. He's great. He's fantastic for a lot of different reasons. He's a really unique player. The journey's fantastic. All the above. He's a vital piece to what the Wolves are doing moving forward. However, Rudy Nas minutes with no Cat were actually slightly worse than Rudy Cat minutes with no Nas, and actually a lot worse offensively. Rudy and Nas together on the floor last season with no Karl-Anthony Towns was a 31st percentile offensive unit. I know that's probably shocking to hear, but it's true. A 31st percentile offensive unit. Again, Rudy and Nas with no Karl-Anthony Towns. They averaged just 111.8 points scored per 100 possessions. Turnovers were a big issue, nearly a 16% turnover rate. Defensively, though, they were phenomenal. 99th percentile defense, 103.3 points allowed per 100 possessions. And the defense was so good that it meant that overall it was still an 89th percentile unit, any unit that had Nas and Rudy together. Now, we could break this down a bit further, like, for instance, the most used lineup that had Nas and Rudy on the floor together with no Cat was the starting lineup with no Cat. So that was after the Karl-Anthony Towns injury in March into early April, the starting lineup of Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Nas, and Rudy. The starting lineup, I know that Nas didn't always start. He did a little bit of the time, but otherwise it was Kyle Anderson. But that unit, right, the four starters minus Cat plus Nas was a 12th percentile offensive unit. But they were still 84th percentile defensively. Overall, they were a net rating of 0. The next most used lineup, which was like half as many minutes, only 200 minutes, but it was a big lineup with no point guard. Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Kyle Anderson at the 3 with Nas and Rudy was a 96th percentile unit, and the offense was gangbusters. 87th percentile offense, 96th percentile defense, a plus 31.6 differential in about 200 possessions. So, all that to say, these units of Nas and Rudy together were generally terrible offensively, but really, really good defensively. And you look at the Cat lineups, and they were strong offensively and also very good defensively, just not quite as good. So the bottom line is, like, the overall difference isn't that big. It's just how dominant the defense was with Nas on the floor, no Karl-Anthony Towns, which is pretty interesting. So again, I'll do the top line here. So Rudy and Nas, no Cat was an 89th percentile unit, a plus 8.4 in about 1,800 possessions. Rudy and Cat with no Nas was a 90th percentile unit, so only slightly better, a plus 8.8 in 2,500 possessions. So you're talking roughly 700 more possessions, 1 percentile better, and 0.4 points better in those possessions per 100 possessions. But again, with no Cat and with Nas, it's a 31st percentile offense. With Rudy and Cat and no Nas, it's an 82nd percentile offense. So what does that tell us? Well, I think, first of all, the Wolves were a little bit more creative when Cat was off the floor defense. I think they switched a little bit more when Nas was on the floor instead of Cat. And because they had a really switchable team, and Nas, like, they tried to play drops sometimes with Cat. That's never been a strong suit. They avoided it as much as they could last year. But with Nas, they switched more often. And Nas held his own on the perimeter a lot of times. Offensively, it wasn't as good because Nas is just not as efficient of an offensive player as Karl-Anthony Towns. And I know Nas had a really good year shooting the ball last year. And we could dig, again, the two-man pairings are inherently noisy because there's, of course, 3 other guys on the floor at all times. And so it could also have to do with the Nas lineups. Oftentimes you're playing with more bench guys who, by definition, aren't going to be as good as your starters. So that plays into it as well. But the point here is it's not like there's going to be some immediate massive improvement offensively with no Cat plus Nas. Cat's a better offensive player than Nas Reid. Cat's a better offensive player than Julius Randle. But defensively, I think this is fascinating. Rudy and Nas with no Cat was a 99th percentile defense because of the switching, etc. Julius Randle, same deal. Julius Randle's around the same size, like around the same build as Nas. They're both a little bit smaller than Karl-Anthony Towns. Julius Randle's a physical defender. He's switchable. One of the things that Alex Wolf of Locked On Knicks and I talked about on Monday is how well he performed in some of these bigger guarding, some of these bigger, more physical wings and forwards, like a Luka Doncic. Trying to remember who else he brought up, but like other big scoring guys, like scoring guards and scoring wings. Randle performed well in those matchups. Karl-Anthony Towns did in some as well. Obviously, he was very good against Jokic, different than Luka. But like that's not like Julius Randle's an option to guard Luka Doncic is phenomenal. To have him out there, or at the very least be switchable where you're comfortable with him on these perimeter switches. And there was a limit to how comfortable Chris Finch and the Wolves coaching staff was with Cat switching everything. And so Nas and Randle are both going to be a bit more switchable, and it still allows you to keep Rudy out of those actions, leave him on the back line, roam, swat shots, protect the paint, protect the rim, and so forth. So that's clearly part of the calculation here for the Wolves is we can maintain some flexibility defensively, and the offense, while not as good with Rudy and Nas on the floor and no Cat, there's upside there. There's upside there. And in those minutes with Anthony Edwards on the floor, they were much better, of course, as a trio. I'm not going to get super into that today, but I thought that was really fascinating to break that down. And also that Julius Randle's minutes with the Knicks, with it wasn't across the board, like the numbers aren't across the board strong with rim protecting bigs. They were only good with the good rim protecting bigs, which bodes well, of course, for him to play with Rudy Gobert. But again, I think the flexibility, the switchability is going to be super important as we look at the Julius Randle fit in Minnesota and some of those different lineups that did and didn't work with the Knicks. I want to talk a little bit more about that and kind of add, let's add Dante DiVincenzo into the mix. I'm still focusing on Julius Randle, but I think as another new member of the Wolves, I think it's interesting to look at some of those lineups with the Knicks, DiVincenzo plus Randle plus some of these rim protecting bigs, see how that all breaks down. And again, talk a little bit about the depth and the potential lineups that Chris Finch could turn to now that Julius Randle's in Minnesota. So we'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. No matter where you like buying tickets or what sort of events you like buying tickets for, use Game Time Picks to get a curation of your favorite events. So it's sports, but it's also concerts, it's comedy shows, it's theater, all of the above, like any sort of live event, Your one-stop shop is Game Time. One of the best features that they have is all-in pricing. You can toggle this feature on to show you the total up front, so that way you have no surprise fees at checkout. Again, toggle on the all-in pricing to see that up front. You can also get a panoramic view from your seats in the app before you buy, and their lowest price guarantee means that if you think you find a better price somewhere else, instead, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKDOWNNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKDOWNNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, so Julius Randle with the Knicks. We talked about the Mitchell Robinson minutes were positive. If you put Robinson, Randle, and Dante DiVincenzo, and again, I'm using Robinson because he's the most similar thing that the Knicks had to Rudy Gobert. Those lineups together with that trio were a plus 3.5, a 71st percentile unit. They were 99th percentile offensively. Now, many of those lineups include Jalen Brunson, and that's a big reason for it. There's one that had the since traded Emmanuel quickly. The others were Brunson, DiVincenzo, Randall Robinson with another player. So like RJ Barrett was one of them. Josh Hart's another. But all of those lineups were positive except the one with Emmanuel quickly. For whatever that's worth, like that one was also not great defensively and had DiVincenzo at the 3, quickly at the 2. So perhaps a little bit dicey there on the defensive end of the floor. And by the way, overall, I said 99th percentile offensively. Defensively, these units were a 2nd percentile. So that's why overall together, they still ended up being 71st percentile because the offense was just that dominant. We see this weird, there was the weird difference between the Wolves numbers from last year. In a smaller number of possessions, you're going to get some weird, like the wonkiness of the offense being so dominant, the defense being the opposite. But overall, it evens out to it being a slightly positive unit. DiVincenzo, I talked about this quite a bit on Tuesday's show. I think the middle of Tuesday's show, if you missed it. DiVincenzo's off-ball defense is going to be a key to this trade. And I think that's another thing that's going to help these units. With Randle's a switchable big, Gobert guarding the paint, DiVincenzo's a strong off-ball guard, and then whoever the primary defenders are, whether that's Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Dike Alexander-Walker, maybe Mike Conley. Like there's plenty of these guys who should be plug and play on the point of attack. And then you've got these wing defenders, off-ball guys who are still switchable, like DiVincenzo, Julius Randle, switchable as a big. I do, the more I have dug into this, the more I think about it, the more I like this setup from a defensive flexibility standpoint. As much as I think having the physicality and size of Towns guarding in certain matchups, we obviously have the playoffs and Jokic and Durant fresh in our minds, a little bit of recency bias there. There were moments in the regular season where that didn't necessarily happen the way that the Wolves tried to draw it up. And I just think there's more options now. Like you can look basically 1 through 10, and there's plenty of different lineups you can try it out there to address different opponents. Which brings me to my last point I want to make today, which is related to the Timberwolves' depth overall, and also Randle's presence. I think there's no question, and I should say this, I've said it a couple times over the last few days. I said it on Twitter because people were saying the opposite. I don't think there's any way Julius Randle doesn't start with this team. You're not going to tell a guy who's an all-star the last 2 years, who's new to the team, who's replacing Karl-Anthony Towns, that he's not starting. And it doesn't necessarily mean he's finishing. And I think it's going to depend on the matchup more than anything else. Naz Reid could end up playing crunch time in games that the Wolves need more offense. They need both guys fairly switchable defensively. But I think Randle playing with the starters and then being one of the first out when Naz comes in, and then perhaps we see Randle and Naz play together and Rudy sit. I think that's it. That we're going to see a little bit of that. Like I'm ballparking this completely, and we'll probably get more in the weeds on potential rotation, minutes allocation, I guess, here in the coming weeks. But I see this as Conley, Ant, Jaden, Randle, Rudy. First 5-6 minutes of the game, Rudy sits, maybe he gets first break, and we see Naz come in and play with Randle. Then we see Randle sit, Rudy comes in to play with Naz. And the Randle Naz minutes probably are, 8 minutes a game? And then the rest of the time, you've got Randle and Rudy or Nas and Rudy on the floor. The other thing, though, is the possibility. I think I mentioned this on Tuesday. If Randle's like your other creator, your other guy that can score in isolation, but also distribute for others, like the two guys on the roster that can do both of those things. Like we know, obviously Conley distributes for others. He's not creating his own offense, right? Jaden is not really creating his own offense. Rudy's not. Like there's nobody else, maybe down the line around Dillingham. But the only guys that have done it at the NBA level consistently would be Ant and Randle. Nas can, but he's not running the team when he's on the floor. Like Randle runs the team when he's can run the team. Ant can run the team. I think we see Ant and Randle staggered. So again, say Rudy's the first one out, so Ant and Randle might play the first 8 minutes of the game together. Then one of them sits, hopefully not both of them. So actually that would be the argument for maybe Randle's the first one to sit. So maybe Randle plays the first 6 minutes, he sits. Nas comes in as a regular rotation with Rudy. Randle comes back at the end of the quarter when Ant sits. And now you've got Rudy and Nas on the floor. Probably Nas and Randle with Ant sitting. And now the offense is running through Randle with Nas as the primary, the secondary scorer on the floor with, whomever else, whether it's Alexander Walker or if it's still Conley or Dillingham or Jaden, Dante DiVincenzo. There should be no reason why like 40 to 42 of the 48 minutes don't have one of Julius Randle or Anthony Edwards on the floor. And really, frankly, two of Ant, Randle, and Nas on the floor. You can't, I don't know that there's any other way you can position a Wolves offense that's successful this year without heavy minutes for two of those three always being on the floor together. That's how I think this thing could shake out. So Randle first break, he comes back when Ant sits, and then Ant comes back mid-second quarter, and they play the rest of the first half together. I think that makes a ton of sense. And then your backcourt rotation, we'll talk more about this another day, but obviously Conley and Ant, Dillingham and DiVincenzo and Alexander Walker off the bench. It's really a good problem to have from a depth perspective. The Wolves now have a legit top 10. Your 11th guy was a college basketball finalist for Player of the Year last year in Terrence Shannon Jr. And Josh Minott, who's like your 12th guy now, is the one guy Chris Finch couldn't stop talking about at media day. So like, we'll see if he's able to carve out a role as well. Maybe Joe Ingles plays less than we think he will or whatever. But that's all going to be fascinating to watch. What I want to do on Thursday's show, I want to dig a bit more into DiVincenzo, and we did a little bit of this on Tuesday, but I want to go back to some of the off-ball defense stuff, really kind of reiterate that if you missed that show. We'll talk about the potential for the backcourt rotation. We'll talk about some of DiVincenzo's best lineups that he played with on the Knicks and how that could compare to different Wolves backcourt pairings and trios over the last year in Minnesota. Not that there's really any other significant backcourt turnover, right? Like there obviously was some churn in the Monte Morris, Jordan McLaughlin, Shake Milton type roles, but it's still Conley, it's still Ant, it's still Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Like those were kind of the top three guys no matter what. So we're really talking about what does the three look like behind Jaden McDaniels, and what's Dillingham's role this year. So we'll talk about all that on Thursday's show. I do want to get into player previews, although Friday we'll be previewing an actual game. There's who knows who all is going to play on Friday night, but the Wolves play Friday night. So we'll talk about that later this week too. Otherwise, that's all we got for you today. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can also follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A big thank you once again for making us your first listen today. Now, for your second listen, go find Locked On NBA, where the local experts keep you updated daily on all the biggest storylines ahead of the season. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.